thank you very much, Sean, and thank all of you for coming out tonight to listen to what I have to say about this topic. Having a conversation about male circumcision, it's a very difficult topic for most people to discuss. And I think one of the reasons why it is so difficult is when you criticize circumcision, when you critique the actual practice, what we're actually doing to children, you indirectly critique a bunch of other very personal values that people hold. So you're critiquing the way that they choose to raise their children. That's a very personal thing. You're critiquing their religious beliefs and the religious rituals that they engage in with those beliefs. And people think that's very personal. Who are you to criticize me about my religion? You're also critiquing what people's perception of a normal male genital organ looks like. And again, these are personal things. People have preferences and believe that it's a conversation that shouldn't occur in public, and it's considered very gauche to talk about this topic. So I realize that, and I think having these discussions I think is necessary, because we have this practice that happens in our society all the time. It's a very common thing that happens. Nobody ever seems to want to talk about it. Nobody knows if their friends are circumcised. Nobody knows if their father's circumcised. People just don't want to discuss this issue. And I have been fascinated and deeply disturbed by this practice for many years. And I think that as an anthropological phenomena, the cutting of your children's genitals is a very terrifying and strange thing that we do as a species. And I was first confronted with this issue 20 years ago when I was in medical school. We had to assist with circumcisions in our pediatrics rotation. And at the time, I was relatively indifferent to the procedure. I was certainly very ignorant of it, but I refused to participate in it. I objected to it, conscientiously objected to it. And I couldn't, at the time, articulate why I felt that way. But I would say that over the last 20 years, what started out as an indifference and a relative ignorance about circumcision has developed into a very strong ethical opposition to it. And most intactivists, myself included, believe that everybody owns their own body. Okay? If you don't own your own body, what do you own? Okay? So it's up to the individual to decide which body parts of theirs they would like to cut off. And that's the fundamental issue that we're getting at, is personal autonomy, bodily autonomy. Now, I also happen to believe through my research that there's no medical benefit to this, what is predominantly a social surgery. It's a cultural surgery. I think that it's medically harmful. It has sexual side effects, which I want to go over tonight. And it's a gross violation of human rights. Okay? Everyone can see this when it comes to female circumcision. We have this natural revulsion when we think about female circumcision in our society. Very few people can seem to make the connection to male circumcision. And that's the one thing I'd like to hopefully make an impression on you tonight, is that the procedures, although they're different in extremity, in terms of the severity of the injury, they're philosophically the same type of injury to children. So that's where I'm going with this. Now, I know this is a talk of humanists, so I thought I'd start with a quote from a very famous humanist. Thomas Jefferson said, "It matters of style swim with the current. In matters of principle stand like a rock." So this, to most intactivists, is a matter of principle. And I would say that having a zero tolerance policy for genital cutting of children is a very ethically sound position to have. Okay, the medical debates will happen, the medical debates will continue to rage, but most intactivists aren't concerned about the medical benefits after a certain point because of the ethical compromise that you have to do to accept circumcision. So let's talk about the prevalence first of all. Now this is figures from the World Health Organization 2010. So these are relatively recent figures. So we'll start with our own country, Canada. So when I was born in 1971, the incidence of circumcision in Canada was about 70%. And so 30% of males were intact at that time. And we use the term intact instead of uncircumcised, and that's very deliberate. If uncircumcised is a very misleading term, it's part of the nomenclature of trickery. If a woman has not had a mastectomy, do we call her unmastectomized? Is that the term that we say? She's unmastectomized? No, she's a woman with intact breasts. So males who have not had circumcision, they're not uncircumcised, because that term implies that the default position is circumcision, and that not being circumcised is somehow abnormal, or it's an alternate state. So we use circumcised and intact. So in the year I was born, 30% of Canadian males were left intact. Now that number has fallen, the number of circumcision prevalence has fallen down to 28%. So the vast majority of males now in our country are being left intact. So 28% across the whole country. We see very different regional rates, though. In Newfoundland has not recorded a non-medically necessary circumcision for 3 years, so the incidence is almost 0% in Newfoundland. In the maritime provinces, it's somewhere around 12 to 15%, so it's very low out east. Quebec is about 14%. Ontario really skews things. Ontario is about 46%, so it's much more common in Ontario. It's more common in the prairie provinces, it's in the 30s, and then it drops down a little bit in BC, about 20%. So it's very regional in Canada, with the Maritimes having extremely low rates of circumcision. The United States, the year I was born, was about 90% of males were circumcised. There wasn't even a consent form. It's just when the baby's born, they check off, has he been circumcised? That was the practice in the U.S. And what we see now in the U.S., the overall incidence is about 50%. So it's about 50-50 in the United States now. And there are very strong regional differences in the U.S. as well. In the West Coast, especially the Southwest, has very low rates, high 20s, 20%, 20 to 28%. And this is in part due to the large Hispanic and Asian populations in those areas, which are traditionally non-circumcising cultures. But it's also the West Coast U.S. is where a lot of the grassroots intactivist movements are occurring. It's where you may have read the papers last year when San Francisco tried to pass a circumcision ban. So a lot of the anti-circumcision movement right now is based out of the United States, the West Coast, and it's starting to spread to the rest of the country very slowly. The Northeast has higher rates. It's over 50% in the Northeast area and in the Midwest as well. So that's North America. And you would expect, well, the numbers must be the same. Yes?
Sorry, any data from the South?
Southern U.S. Southern U.S. tends to be like southern Texas, Arkansas.
Southeast, like that's the
tends to be fairly high. So you would think that North Americans and Europeans are pretty similar culturally, so the rates would be similar, and nothing could be further from the truth. In England, which was one of the countries where circumcision was commonly performed, they had relatively high rates in about the 1940s. The neonatal circumcision rate in England now is 3%. So 3% of babies are circumcised. You randomly pick a man off the street in England, about 13% chance that that man is circumcised, because we're seeing the dwindling from the 40s and 50s in the UK population. Scandinavia is one of those parts of the world that never really embraced circumcision. And in fact, in Finland, it's actually illegal to perform a circumcision on a child, because the child is unable to consent for the procedure. It's not medically necessary, therefore it's an assault. So children in Finland are protected under law from circumcision. And it's a very interesting cohort because you have a group of males with a 0% circumcision rate. So you can follow these males and see, well, what are the medical complications? What are the risks of being an intact male? And we know from Finland that the chances of requiring a medically necessary circumcision are 1 in 17,000. So 1 in 17,000 males in Finland will actually need a circumcision at some point before they hit the age of 18. So it's a very small number of males that actually require circumcision for medical reasons. Sweden, the incidence is about 1.2%. Circumcision rates is extremely low in Sweden. Denmark, 1.6%. Spain and France are just under 2%. Italy's the same thing, around under 2%. And Russia is very low as well. Now, China is a country of Buddhist philosophy where there's strong taboos against bodily mutilation and body modification, and circumcision has never existed in China. So here you have 1.5 billion people living in China, okay, and none of them are circumcised. None of the males in China are circumcised. So if we accept the medical risks of penile cancer and urinary tract infections and bladder cancer and cervical cancer, I mean, there should be people dying every day from their penises in China. There should be dead bodies in the streets of China, people who died from not being circumcised. And of course, we don't see this. It's never existed in that culture. It's not an issue. And most Chinese parents are repulsed by the concept of actually cutting their male infants. Okay, so, and India is the exact same thing. The rates are not measurable because the practice does not exist there. Japan has a circumcision rate of less than 1%, 0.8%. And it's interesting because across the Sea of Japan in South Korea, the circumcision rate is 80%. Okay, so you have two countries right beside each other. You can tell who's Korean and who's Japanese by whether they're circumcised or not. And of course, in Korea, it's the remnants of the Korean War and the medical implementation by the Americans, which, you know, that they basically introduced circumcision into Korea in the mid-1950s after the war. We see these dark areas. The Muslim countries and Israel have very high rates of circumcision because it's religiously mandated in those parts of the world. Israel reports a 100% circumcision rate, although their pediatric society does not officially recommend circumcision. But they say that 100% of males in Israel are circumcised. Mexico and South America have very low rates as well. All of those countries have rates less than 9%. So it's exceedingly uncommon in South America as well. So, and then the last country I'll talk about is Australia. Now, Australia was like us. In the 1970s, their rates were about 75%, a little bit higher than ours were. Australia now, the Australian Medical Association, Australian culture completely rejects male infant genital cutting. And their circumcision rates are less than 10% now. So they've significantly shifted the way that their society views circumcision, and they have the lower rates now. We should, I think, try to aim for what Australia has achieved. Now, the history of circumcision is fascinating, and it's something that I've been interested in for a long time. Our first historical evidence of circumcision is from Egypt, ancient Egypt, and in the necropolis of Saqqara, there's beautiful stone carvings on the walls depicting a ritual of circumcision. And that was around 2,400 BC, okay, so quite a while ago. And there's in the hieroglyphics written underneath it, it says, "Catch him because he will faint." That's what it says in the Egyptian underneath it. And we know that in Egypt, that circumcision, it was probably a compromise or a substitute for castration. And the priests who underwent this were considered very elite. Okay? They entered into a very elite priestly caste. They had to shave all the hair off their body. They couldn't eat fish. They had to bathe 3 times a day. There was all these other things associated with it, but it was a real entrance into a very elite, very personal relationship with the pharaoh. So this was a very important religious ritual to a very small minority of priests living in Egypt. Now, from North Africa, the practice then spread into the Semitic tribes living in Israel and Jordan and Syria today. And the book of Jeremiah describes many tribes living in that area as circumcising tribes. So the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Israelites are all described as cultures that participate in circumcision. And with the Israelites, it corresponds to the time when the Israelites returned from captivity in Babylon. They came back to Jerusalem and they created the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And this was around 500 BCE. And at that time, there was an establishment of a very strong, very rigid theocracy in Jewish religion. And it was very top-heavy, very ruled from iron fist down. And up until that point, circumcision was not as ubiquitous as people think in the Israelite culture. It seems around 500 BCE that the practice really seemed to take hold and become mandatory. And it raises the question, well, if this is a tribal marking, why the penis? Why not a tattoo? Why not an earring, a nose ring? Why not some other form of tribal marking? Why the penis indeed, right? And I think the answer to that question sort of answers itself. Okay? If you're a father and you're bringing your son to the community, to the tribe for acceptance, your posterity, your best chance for posterity, for your future lineage rests on your son's penis. Okay, that is the thing that's most likely to carry on your lineage, your family name. And to take your child and present them to the tribe, to the community, and say, I'm so committed to this tribe that I'm willing to do this risky thing to my son. It's an incredible show of devotion to the tribe. And the flip side of that, it's an incredible show of power from the ruling theocracy. If we can make you do this to your kids, if you step out of line, we're going to make it a lot worse for you. Okay, so it's a real power statement, circumcision. It's a very, very powerful thing, and there's no coincidence that it's the penis. Okay, this is very, very deliberate. Now, we also know about the circumcising tribes living in the Middle East from the Greeks, and Herodotus wrote quite extensively about circumcising tribes. And he actually wrote with disdain and disgust, because the Greeks felt completely different about circumcision than the Semitic tribes did. And the ancient Greeks recognized the sexual function of the foreskin, the sexual pleasurable attributes of the foreskin, and they considered the practice barbaric. And not many people know this, but Aristotle wrote a sex manual. It's very similar to the Kama Sutra. It was a manual about sex. And he explicitly, in the sex manual, talks about the mechanical function of the foreskin, the sexual sensory function of the foreskin. He explains what most Western physicians are completely ignorant of today, 2,400 years ago, in his sex manual. So the Greeks, and the other thing is, in addition to the medical aspect of it, the Greeks viewed circumcision as a very strong political tool. Okay, they considered it an example of the superiority of Greek rationalism over the irrational cults of the Middle East. Okay, the irrationality and superstition of Jerusalem. The Greeks were very rational about it. And the other thing is the Greek aesthetic. If you look at their pottery and their paintings, the male organs are always depicted as a very accentuated foreskin, very elongated foreskin. And in Greek society, it was considered very gauche, and exposed glands of the penis was considered very gauche, very, very private. That implies sexual arousal. And it was in the Greek baths, to see an exposed glands was considered very, very sordid, very, very low class. So there are writings of Spartan warriors capturing prisoners from the Middle East, and if they were circumcised, just executed. They didn't even want them as slaves, okay, because they considered people that were willing to circumcise their children were subhuman. They didn't want to be associated with them. So Greeks were very strong prohibitions against genital cutting. Now, the Romans, of course, inherited the Greek philosophy on many things, including medicine and law. And in the Roman Empire, circumcision was illegal, and it wasn't a guise of anti-Semitism. The Romans made circumcision illegal because it conflicted with their philosophy of self-determination. One of the most important things in Roman philosophy is that everybody should be in charge of their own destiny. So here's a culture that gladiatorial combat for fun is perfectly acceptable, but cutting children's penises that's where they draw the line, right? So there's a real dichotomy with ancient. And Titus Clemens, Emperor 95 AD in Rome, he was crucified, not for the crime of becoming Jewish, of converting to Judaism, but for circumcising himself. So he was actually killed for that. Now, the Romans tolerated Jews living in the occupied territories. They allowed Jews to continue to practice circumcision on themselves, but if they were caught circumcising Romans, or if they were caught circumcising their slaves, then they were also executed. Now, towards the end of the Roman Empire, as Christianity emerged as the dominant religion in the empire, we know about the letters of Paul to the Romans, Saul of Tarsus, who went to Damascus, and you know the rest. But as Paul writes these letters to the Romans, and Paul and the other church fathers, they're very explicit, saying that to convert to Christianity, you do not need to perform the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant of circumcision. And at that time, the Christians were competing with other Eastern mythical religions, like Mithraism, for instance, was very popular at that time. So early Christian fathers, they didn't want the Jewish converts. This was a very small minority. They wanted the pagans, the Roman pagans, to join their religion. So it created a lot of conflict between Jewish converts who became Christians and Roman pagans who became Christians about what was the final ruling on circumcision. Did you have to be circumcised to become a Christian or not? Right? Did you have to become a Jew first and then you could become a Christian? So there was a lot of conflict based over circumcision at that time. As I mentioned, in ancient China, the other great empire at the time, there's no historical writings of circumcision. Not even look what they do. There's literally no mention of it. It never existed. The practice is as foreign as cutting off thumbs would be to us. Okay, so you have this long-standing, rich heritage, this incredibly diverse empire with not a single mention of circumcision in China. Now, we're going to go forward to the Middle Ages now. And Moses Maimonides. Now, Moses Maimonides was a Jewish physician, and he was a Jewish philosopher as well. And he was one of the most brilliant physicians of his day. And he was actually the personal physician to Salah ad-Din, the Arab ruler who defeated the Crusaders. And he was a very smart man. This is what he wrote about circumcision. He says, the purpose of circumcision is to bring about a decrease in sexual intercourse and a weakening of the sexual organ. Circumcision does not perfect what is defective physically, it perfects what is defective morally. The bodily pain caused to that member is the real purpose of circumcision. For if at birth this member has been made to bleed and its covering taken away, it is undoubtedly weakened. Although procreation is not rendered impossible, the lusts and pleasures beyond which are needed are diminished. So here's a Jewish physician and philosopher saying, the covenant is bullshit. It's really about decreasing sexual pleasure. It's the whole pruning of the fruit tree type of philosophy, toning down the sexual impulse. This is considered good for the society. He also goes on to say that it's mandatory that it be performed at 8 days. And the reason that he gives is if you wait longer, there's going to be an attachment between the father and the son. And he says the father may be reluctant at that point to carry through with the ritual. So it has to be done right away before there's any bonding between the father and the son. And the other thing that he writes, remember, this is a Jewish man. He says it's very important that Jewish women do not have sexual relations with uncircumcised, intact men. And he says, because if they have sex with uncircumcised men, it'll be more difficult for them to leave that man and marry a Jewish man. So this is what he's conceding as a Jew. So this is a pretty interesting insight from this man. He was also a well-respected physician. Now, in the Middle Ages, circumcision was synonymous with very derogatory and violent anti-Semitism. Okay? Your average Christian living in the Middle Ages, who was a peasant, who was ignorant, who was uneducated, was just scared to death of the Jewish ritual of circumcision. It was, if they're willing to do this to their own children, what would they do to my children as part of one of their rituals, right? So it was always associated with an intense fear. Now this is from the Chronicles of Nuremberg, and this is from 1475, this parchment. And it's portraying the murder of Simeon de Trent, who was a boy that they found murdered in a basement in Trent, Italy, in the 1400s. And it happened to be that it was in the basement of a Jewish family. So the town became enraged. There was a massive blood libel. They rounded up all the Jews in the town. They executed 15 of them by fire. They burned them to death at the stake for sorcery and witchcraft and performing these rituals. And the rest they expelled from the town. This became a popular news story throughout Europe. And this is the German depiction of that story, of the murder of Simon. And you can see these are all Jewish members that live in the town. And this is, of course, Simon. And the first thing you see is there's always knives associated with Jews in the Middle Ages. There are always knives and blood. You can see they're catching the blood right here in a pan. So this was the mental picture of most Christians in Europe of what Jews wanted to do. They wanted to cut things with knives and collect the blood. And it led to this very, very violent anti-Semitism. Circumcision was an enormous part of that in the Middle Ages. Now in the Renaissance, in 1442, the Catholic Church declared circumcision a mortal sin. And before you get too excited thinking that the Catholic Church has actually made a ruling on sexuality, it's not totally stupid. It was done as another act of anti-Semitism. They're basically saying that if you circumcise your children, you'll go to hell, right? So this is just disguised anti-Semitism. But it is interesting, though, that most of Christian Europe rejected the ritual. And right up until the 18th century, it was essentially the only people in Europe that were circumcised were either Muslims or Jews living in Europe. Almost all Christians rejected the ritual. Okay, now we're going to shift a little bit into the medical side of this, and this is the foundation of why I think this is a horrible thing to do. So we talk about the foreskin like it's a separate anatomical structure, like it's a separate body part. The foreskin is part of the penis. Okay, it's just part of the penile covering that we give it a special name so that when we cut it off, we can say we cut off that part of the penis. The foreskin is a very unique mucocutaneous junction. The only other thing in our bodies that is similar to this is your eyelids. You have skin on the outside of the eyelid and a mucous membrane on the inside of that. It's a highly specialized structure. In a male, the foreskin is more than 50% of the surface area covering of the penis. So what's removed in circumcision, this is the coronal sulcus, where the head of the penis starts. In a grown male, the foreskin extends from that area to the end, but then it folds in on itself and it comes back. Okay, it's a double-sided structure. It's equivalent to about 15 square inches. If you were to take it out and unfold it, it's 15 square inches of tissue, which is more than half the skin on the entire penis. The inner surface of the foreskin, the mucosal surface of the foreskin, is the most heavily innervated tissue on the male body. I'll say that again. The inner surface of the foreskin is the most heavily innervated tissue on the male body. Okay. There are 20,000, some anatomists think 80,000 very specialized neuroreceptors that live on that part of the penis. These neuroreceptors are called Meissner's corpuscles and Ruffini-endings. They are the most sensitive nerve receptors in the body. The other place where they're almost as densely populated is in your fingertips. Okay, that's the difference between the front of the finger and the back of the finger. The front of the finger has Meissner's corpuscles, which are very superficial. They're right adjacent to the surface of the skin, and they're exquisitely sensitive. Now, you can see that as the penis becomes erect, a normal intact penis, the foreskin retracts to allow the accommodation of the growth of the penis. Okay? So this gives you an idea of what's actually cut off. So if you're cutting off from here to there and then back underneath, you're cutting off this tissue from this blue line to there. Okay? That's what's removed in an infant circumcision. A baby infant's penis will grow 32 times larger by the time you're an adult male. Okay? So cutting off this small part in a baby has enormous consequences for an adult male. This area right here, it's called the ridged band or Taylor's band. It is the highest concentration of those specialized neuroreceptors that we talked about. In addition to the 20,000 specialized corpuscular receptors, there's about 270 feet of nerve fibers, blind-ended nerve fibers as well, which is exquisitely densely innervated. There's over 3 feet of capillary bed. You can see the vascular color to the inner prepuce. It's extremely richly vascularized to accommodate all those nerve fibers. We also know that there are apocrine glands, which nobody really knows the function, but likely to produce pheromones. So they've done studies in rats. When a male rat's foreskin retracts, it can induce a state of estrus, a state of heat in the female rat right away. So, and they've studied this. There's a chemical transmission of pheromones in rats that occurs. Most anatomists think that the apocrine glands that live on the inner foreskin are for producing pheromones. There's also estrogen receptors, which has been recently discovered. Nobody really knows what the estrogen receptors are for. People have proposed, well, that it's maybe transmucosal communication between the vagina and the penis. It's a little bit far-fetched for my taste, but again, the estrogen receptors are there for a reason. Nobody's really studied why that is. I don't know if you've ever seen the intactivist sticker. The foreskin is not the wrapper; it's the candy. Okay, everyone thinks it's there to protect the head. The foreskin is the most pleasurable part of the penis. this is what I mean by the Meissner's corpuscles. The Meissner's corpuscles are these things right here. Okay, this is an actual histological section of the foreskin. This is a Meissner's corpuscle right here. Okay, this is how close it is to the skin. It's about 3 cells away from the skin. It's very superficial. It's a coiled neuroreceptor, so it's sensitive to stretch too. So it's the movement of the foreskin that stimulates this type of neuroreceptor. It's also very sensitive to gradations of temperature as well. What you see in the head of the penis is Pacinian corpuscles, these green things right here. Now these are very deep neuroreceptors, and they're basically only sensitive to vibration. Okay? They're not the very fine touch neuroreceptors that you see on the foreskin. These are very rudimentary. There are 10 times more neuroreceptors on the foreskin than there are in the head of the penis. Okay? So the head of the penis is one of the least sensitive areas compared to the inner foreskin. Now, one of the frustrating things about talking to people about this, especially intact men, is the statement, well, I'm circumcised and I'm fine. Right? Sex is fine for me. There's no problems with sex for me. And yes, sex is very pleasurable, right? But the analogy that I like is if there's a Mozart symphony that you love, say it's your favorite piece of music, and you've never heard it with the violas, okay? You've heard it with all the other instruments, and it's very beautiful, and it's a very beautiful piece of music, but there's no violas in it. Why the hell don't you want to hear it with the violas? Okay? The violas are your birthright. That's what you're born with. And if you want to take the violas out of the Mozart symphony, that should be your decision. Circumcision does that. It removes sexual pleasure from the penis. Now, there's been very little studies that have actually documented a difference in sensitivity between the circumcised penis and the intact penis. Now, 2007, we have a very, very good study, which was published in San Francisco by Morris Sorrells. He's a Jewish urologist, and this is what he did. So he took circumcised penis and intact penis, and he compared the sensitivity to different parts of the penis. And he used these Siemens-Weinstein monofilaments to test the pressure thresholds. And they're much more sensitive than what you see here. They're the size of a human hair. And he basically mapped out where the most sensitive areas are on the penis. And before we show you the results of that study, just look at the 2 pictures. Okay? So on the left, this brown ring right here, this is the circumcision scar. That's the brown type of scar is almost always from a gomphoid gland. It's a type of one of the plastidels that's used for circumcision. That's not a normal anatomical structure. Okay, that was up in this area when the child was a baby. You'll notice the skin color of the glands of the head of the penis. It's almost the same as the shaft. Okay, that is not normal. That is because there's been keratinization of the glands. So most circumcised penises have 10 times thicker keratin laid on top of them because the body is trying to protect what is meant to be an internal structure. Okay, the normal gland's penis is purple. It's thin. It's a very, very supple, very, very sensitive part of the body that's usually protected by the foreskin. Okay, so this is a pathological state related to externalizing an internal structure. So he tested all the areas. This is the intact male, okay, forward and then retracted. This is the back view, forward and then retracted. Now the purple and red areas are the most sensitive regions. These are the areas with the lowest pressure thresholds. Okay? You can see the very, very low pressure thresholds, the tiniest filaments. And you can see that there's way more sensitive tissue on the intact penis than there is on the circumcised penis. And that sensitive tissue is the inner foreskin. Okay? So circumcision has removed the most sensitive part of the penis on the male. This is an actual graph of the pressure thresholds. And these areas right here, so dark bars are circumcised men, the light gray bars are intact men. And you see just a general trend that the intact men have lower pressure thresholds everywhere on the penis, okay, because of the keratinization effect that I talked about. But the most sensitive regions, right down here, these are the inner foreskin regions. Once the foreskin is retracted and they've touched it, these are all the most sensitive areas. There is no dark bar there because all of those areas have been amputated from circumcised men. Okay. This is the head of the penis right here, number 8, you can still see that there's lower pressure thresholds in the intact men. And then this is the outer foreskin, the skin part of the foreskin. It's also exquisitely sensitive. Okay? This is the second most sensitive area on the penis. No dark bars, because that tissue's been removed from circumcision. The most sensitive areas on the circumcised penis are where the scars are. Okay? So, and you could ask circumcised men, almost all of them will say that the most pleasurable part of their penis is between the scar and the head of the penis. And the reason why is because that's where the foreskin used to be. So there's intense neuroma formation that occurs along that area at the site of the amputation. The mechanical function of the foreskin is extremely important. And the foreskin is basically, it acts as a linear bearing mechanism. It's a to and fro gliding mechanism. And most of it's an ingenious result of evolution. It's a sheath moving inside of a sheath. It decreases friction, it makes sex easier and pleasurable for both parties. On the outstroke, you can see how the foreskin bunches up, okay? And what that does is it seals the vaginal opening. It seals the vaginal opening so that vaginal lubricants are not pulled out during sex. A circumcised penis with a coronal hook is actually pulling vaginal lubricants out. So it's no coincidence that the lion's share of vaginal lubricants are sold in the United States, the country that circumcises children the most. So the foreskin is designed to trap in vaginal lubricants. On the instroke, the foreskin unfolds and it exposes that very sensitive area that I talked about, the ridged band. It lines up exactly with the Grafenberg spot, the G-spot in the vagina. So you have the most sensitive part of the vaginal mucosa lining up with the most sensitive part of the penile mucosa. Okay? Does this surprise anyone? Did we not co-evolve together as both sexes, right? Our parts have evolved to fit together this way. And if you think, I'm pretty weird getting into this, these people, this study, they attached a very sensitive scale to the back of an artificial vagina. And they asked intact men and circumcised men to place their erect penises in and hit a buzzer at the back. And hopefully they could reach the buzzer. But the intact men required 1/10 the force to reach that buzzer as a circumcised man, because most of the forward translation is most of the forward movement is translated in the unfolding of the foreskin. Okay, it's a sheath working inside of a sheath. This is a study from Denmark. Now you can search literature all day and you'll find conflicting studies. Some studies say that circumcision makes sex better. Some studies say it has no effect on sex. Some studies say it makes sex worse. You can cherry pick all the studies you want. At the end of the day, you have to ask yourself the following question. Do I think cutting off 20,000 highly specialized sexual sensory receptors will make sex better? Or do I think cutting off 20,000 highly specialized sensory receptors will make sex worse? Okay? That's the question everybody has to answer. This is a study from Denmark, which is a non-circumcising country, so it was probably very biased. But it was a questionnaire to 6,000 participants, men and women, and they were looking for associations of sexual difficulty with circumcision. And the men, these are the circumcised men, and these are the intact men. And orgasm difficulties include premature ejaculation and inability to achieve orgasm. And you know, you've heard people say, well, if I was any more sensitive, it would be horrible, blah, blah, blah. But the foreskin and all that extra sensation is the difference between an on and off switch and an accelerator pedal. Okay? Most intact men can feel orgasm approaching a little bit in more detail than circumcised men. It's an on-off switch that you create when you remove all that sexual tissue. These are the female responses, so I don't know what an incomplete fulfillment is, but it sounds horrible. And it's more of a problem in women with circumcised partners. Frequent dysfunction, orgasm difficulties, and painful sex is a significant difference for the gliding mechanism that we talked about in the previous slide. Now, I'm going to turn to evolutionary perspectives on the foreskin. And this is a quote from Richard Dawkins. It says, "Evolution is a miserly accountant, counting the pennies, watching the clock, punishing even the smallest inefficiencies. Evolution does not tolerate frivolous design or redundancy. Ruthless utilitarianism always trumps." Okay? So, as we know, evolution through natural selection, the currency of evolution is reproductive success. It doesn't matter how fast you are, how strong you are, how smart you are, how fast you can climb a tree. The only thing that matters in evolution is, do you leave more offspring than the other guy? And if you do, then the species looks more like you and less like the other guy. Okay? So are we to suggest that the actual organ of reproduction, the very mechanism of natural selection, has a design flaw in it, okay? That it's not efficient, that it's not meant to be that way, or that it's prone to disease, is a complete misunderstanding of how evolution works, right? The organ is the way it is because it has shown success in reproduction. It's the very organ of reproduction. So it's a little bit egotistical and a little bit arrogant for physicians to believe that we can improve that by cutting parts of it off. Okay? So I think that the evolutionary perspective, this debate about circumcision versus intact, was settled millions of years ago on this African savanna. The prepuce, the foreskin, has a function. Now, the 5 more minutes. Now, we're African apes, and our closest ancestors are other African apes, chimpanzees and bonobos, and we diverged from that common ancestor about 5 million years ago. You can compare us to other primates as well, like monkeys, spider monkeys, and rhesus monkeys, and we diverged from other primates about 20 million years ago. If you look at our more distant primate cousins, so spider monkeys and rhesus monkeys, you see that most of the innervation in monkeys is on the glands, the head of the penis. Okay, these are the neuroreceptors here. It's all on the head of the penis. And there's very little innervation on foreskin. Monkeys have very short copulatory times. There is virtually no paternal investment in the offspring other than just donating sperm. Okay, the female monkeys are basically responsible for raising the offspring. Chimpanzees and bonobos, which are more closely related to us, have much more innervation on the foreskin and relatively little innervation on the glands of the penis. Chimpanzees have longer copulatory times and much more paternal investment in raising the offspring. Human beings, we are this extreme example. We have virtually all of our innervation on the inner foreskin, with very little innervation on the head of the penis. Okay? So what this, and of course we have longer copulatory times than chimpanzees and much more paternal investment in raising the young. So what this pattern suggests is that the heavily innervated foreskin is actually an evolutionary advancement. Okay? It's a trend that we look at other primates, and we see more and more innervation in the foreskin the closer you get to human beings. And this is probably the result of successful pair bonding between males and females, and ensuring that the male is there to help protect and contribute to raising the offspring. This probably provided an evolutionary advantage. So sex became more than just this egg-needing sperm. It became a bit of bonding exercise between opposite sex members in our species. When people talk about, well, it's a vestigial structure and it should be cut off, that's not what comparative anatomy shows. Comparative anatomy shows that it's actually quite an evolutionary advancement. This will be the last slide, and then I'll stop. The argument from antiquity. Now, you may have heard this used in other religious rituals. So I'll give you an example of the aversion to pork among Jews and Muslims. And people would say, well, they don't eat pork because pork was prone to developing parasites and cysticercosis, and people who ate pork got sick. Therefore, they said, we're not going to eat pork, and they put that as part of their religion. People suggested this for circumcision. It has all these health benefits. People very early caught on to it, and therefore that's why it exists. And again, this shows a complete ignorance of evolution and the geological timescales that are required for evolution. And that's what Darwin was able to show us, is that the magnitude of time is unmeasurable. It's just unmeasurable. It's so long. So 4,000 years of genital cutting brings us back to ancient Egypt. Mammals have been diverging from each other for 150 million years. So 4,000 years of cutting the genitals is insignificant from an evolutionary point of view. Okay? There's 150 million years leading up to that time in Egypt when people started doing this. So, and in those 150 million years, we look at the mammals that exist. We have whales, we have cheetahs, we have bats. Okay, bats have evolved wings. Whales have evolved blowholes and tails. Every single mammal has a foreskin. Every single mammal has this trait. So wings can develop, but foreskins don't disappear. So what does that tell you across all mammals? It tells you there's a utility to the structure. There must be utility to it, otherwise you wouldn't see it persisting in so many independent lineages of evolution. I put the CN tower there because it's a phallic symbol, but also if you were to consider mammalian evolution as the CN tower, genital cutting is the paint, the thickness of the paint on the top of the CN tower. That's how long we've been cutting genitals compared to how long they've actually evolved. I think I should take a break right now.